In the early 1900s, deep in the frozen mountains of the American Northwest, forests stood untouched for centuries. Towering pines stretched hundreds of feet into the sky. Snow covered the ground. The air was silent, except for the wind. Then one morning, something broke that silence. At first it sounded like distant thunder. The ground trembled. Birds burst from the treetops. Loggers stopped mid-swing with their axes. And then they saw it. Emerging from the mist and snow was a machine so massive, so unnatural, that many of the workers later said it looked like a creature, not a machine. An iron monster. Thick cables stretched through the forest like metal spiderwebs. Steam poured from its body. Iron wheels groaned under the weight of its enormous frame. And when the operator pulled the lever, the impossible happened. Trees weighing thousands of pounds began sliding across the frozen ground. Entire forests were moving. Logs scraped over rock and ice, dragged across mountainsides as if gravity itself had suddenly stopped matching. Men stood, watching in disbelief, because before this machine arrived, moving a single giant tree could take an entire crew of workers and several horses. But this monster? It could move dozens at once. Mountains that once stopped logging operations suddenly became nothing more than obstacles. Forests that once stood unreachable were now being pulled down the slopes like fallen soldiers. But the power of this machine came with a cost, because when cables snapped, when iron gears jammed, or when a worker stood in the wrong place at the wrong moment, the same machine that moved mountains could destroy a human life in seconds. And yet, despite the danger, the machine kept working, day after day, storm after storm, dragging America's forests across its mountains, because in the industrial age, progress had no mercy, and this iron monster was about to change the entire logging industry forever. At the beginning of the 20th century, America was growing faster than ever before. Cities were rising from dirt and stone. Railroads were stretching across the continent. New homes, factories, bridges, and ships were being built at a staggering pace. And almost all of it required one thing: timber. Millions of trees were needed every single year. Lumber mills ran day and night to keep up with demand. Entire forests disappeared in the span of a few seasons. But the easiest forests had already been cut. The remaining timber stood deep inside mountains, valleys, and frozen wilderness where horses struggled to climb and roads simply didn't exist. Loggers could cut the trees, but moving them, that was the real challenge. A single massive pine could weigh several tons. Even teams of horses could barely pull them across rugged ground. Logs got stuck between rocks. They slid off cliffs. Sometimes entire crews spent days trying to move just a handful of trees. The mountains were winning, and every delay cost the logging companies money. So engineers and industrial inventors began searching for a solution. What they needed was something stronger than horses, something that didn't tire, something powerful enough to drag entire forests across mountains. Steam power was already transforming factories and railroads across the country. Now it was about to invade the wilderness, because somewhere in a small industrial workshop, engineers were designing a machine unlike anything the forest had ever seen. A machine built not for cities, but for war against the mountains themselves. The idea was simple. If steam engines could move trains across continents, why couldn't they move trees across mountains? Engineers began designing massive steam-powered machines capable of pulling enormous weights using steel cables and powerful winches. The result was a machine unlike anything that had ever entered the forests. Heavy iron frames supported giant steam boilers that burned wood and coal. Inside the machine, pistons and gears converted steam pressure into brutal mechanical force. But the true power came from its cables. Thick steel lines stretched hundreds of feet through the forest. When the operator activated the winch system, those cables tightened like iron muscles. Anything attached to them would move. Trees, logs, Even entire piles of timber, what once required dozens of men and animals, could now be done by a single machine and a small crew. But building the machine was only half the challenge. Getting it into the mountains was another problem entirely. These machines often weighed tens of tons. Transporting them required rail cars, wagons, and weeks of preparation. When the machines finally arrived at logging camps, workers assembled them piece by piece in the wilderness. Boilers were bolted into place. Steel cables were stretched through the forest. Operators tested the gears. And then, on the first day of operation, the machine roared to life. Steam exploded from its valves. The winches began turning. And for the first time in history, the forest began to move. Long before the iron monster ever pulled a single log, life in a mountain logging camp was already one of the hardest jobs in America. These camps were built deep in remote forests where winter lasted for months. Snow covered the ground, icy winds swept down the mountains, and temperatures often dropped far below freezing. The men who worked here lived in rough wooden bunkhouses, surrounded by endless trees and silence. Every morning began before sunrise. A bell rang through the camp while the sky was still dark. Loggers climbed out of narrow beds, pulled on heavy wool coats, boots, and thick gloves, then stepped outside into the freezing air. Steam from their breath drifted into the darkness as they walked toward the mess hall for a quick meal. Breakfast was simple: beans, bread, and strong coffee. Then the real work began. Crews marched into the forest, carrying axes, ropes, and long two-man saws. The towering pine trees around them could grow more than 200 feet tall, and each one weighed several tons. Cutting them down was dangerous enough, but moving them through mountains was even worse. That changed when the iron monster arrived. At first, many workers stood staring at the machine in disbelief. It looked less like equipment and more like a living creature made of iron. The massive steam boiler hissed loudly. Thick steel cables stretched through the forest. When the winch drum started turning, the entire machine groaned with power. Suddenly the worksite felt different. Instead of slowly dragging log with horses, entire piles of timber began sliding across the snowy ground. Trees scraped across rocks and crashed into each other as the cables tightened. But the machine created a new kind of danger. Steel cables carried enormous tension. Workers had to constantly watch their surroundings, making sure they stayed far away from moving logs and stretched lines. One mistake, one step in the wrong place, and the power of the iron monster could turn deadly in seconds. Yet every morning the steam rose again. The machine roared to life, and the men returned to the forest, knowing they were now working beside one of the most powerful machines the mountains had ever seen. Despite its incredible strength, the iron monster was never a safe machine. The forests where it worked were unpredictable places filled with steep slopes, loose rocks, hidden stumps, and deep snow that could shift under a man's feet without warning. Every time the machine started pulling, the entire mountainside seemed to come alive. Steel cables stretched across the forest like enormous veins of metal. They connected the machine to piles of freshly cut timber, lying hundreds of feet away. When the operator pulled the lever, steam pressure surged through the system, and the winches began to turn slowly at first, then faster. The cables tightened. The logs trembled. And suddenly, thousands of pounds of timber began sliding across the frozen ground. At first it looked controlled. The logs scraped over snow and ice, leaving long scars in the earth as they moved toward the machine. But forests were chaotic environments, and nothing ever moved exactly the way the operators expected. Sometimes the logs would hit rocks and bounce sideways. Other times they would roll downhill faster than the cables could control. Workers standing nearby had to constantly watch the cables, the terrain, and the moving logs all at the same time. One moment of distraction could be fatal. But the greatest danger came from the cables themselves. Under full tension, those steel lines carried enormous force. If a cable suddenly snapped, It could whip through the air with terrifying speed, cutting through branches, equipment, or anything standing in its path. Loggers learned quickly to stay clear of the cables whenever possible. Yet accidents still happened. A misplaced step, a log rolling the wrong direction, or a cable breaking under pressure. And when something went wrong, the iron monster never stopped instantly. Its gears kept turning, its steam kept building, and its cables kept pulling. Because in the mountains of the early logging industry, power always came first, and safety often came second. Before machines like the iron monster appeared in the forest, logging operations were slow and limited. Crews relied heavily on axes, saws, horses, and brute human strength. Even with dozens of workers, moving large timber across steep mountainsides was a slow and exhausting process. Many forests simply remained untouched because they were too difficult to reach. But when the steam-powered logging machines arrived, the entire industry changed almost overnight. What once took days could now be done in hours. With its powerful winches and steel cables, the iron monster could pull enormous piles of logs across ground that horses could never cross. Hills, rocky slopes, frozen valleys, and thick forests were no longer barriers. Timber that once stood isolated deep inside the wilderness could now be dragged towards sawmills with unstoppable force. Logging companies quickly realized what this meant. Mountains that had protected forests for centuries were suddenly open for business. Operations expanded deeper into remote territories. Logging camps moved farther into the wilderness, following the richest stands of timber wherever they could be found. The machines allowed crews to clear massive areas of forest faster than anyone had imagined possible. Production increased dramatically. Train cars loaded with timber began leaving the mountains every single day, carrying lumber to rapidly growing cities across the country. Railroads expanded. Factories multiplied. Entire towns were built using the wood that came from these mountains. Behind much of that growth stood machines like the iron monster. They didn't just help loggers move trees. They reshaped the entire timber industry. The machines turned remote forests into industrial work zones, where steam engines roared, cables stretched through the trees, and mountains slowly surrendered their forests to the unstoppable force of industrial progress. And although the machines made logging faster and more efficient, they also left a lasting mark on the land itself. Because once the iron monster entered a forest, the landscape would never be the same again. Today, many of the places where these machines once roared have returned to silence. The mountains that once echoed with the grinding gears and hissing steam of logging machines are now covered with new forests, wildlife, and quiet trails. To most visitors walking through these landscapes, it is difficult to imagine that these same hills were once the center of one of the most intense industrial battles in American history. Yet traces of that era still remain. Old logging roads cut faint lines to the mountainsides. Rusted pieces of metal sometimes appear beneath layers of moss and soil. In some remote places, abandoned boilers and broken winches still sit where they were left decades ago, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. These machines, once symbols of unstoppable industrial power, have become relics of a different time, but the impact they had was enormous. The timber they helped harvest built cities, railroads, factories, and homes across the United States. Entire industries depended on the wood that came from these mountains. Without machines like the iron monster, much of that expansion would have taken far longer. For the workers who lived through those years, the machines were both tools and threats. They represented opportunity, wages, and progress, but they also represented danger. Many loggers remember the machines with a mix of respect and fear. They knew that these iron giants could move mountains of timber, yet they also knew how quickly things would go wrong when so much power was unleashed in such a wild environment. Today the machines are silent. The steam has faded. The cables are gone. But the story of the Iron Monster remains part of the history of the mountains. Because once, deep in these forests, a machine powerful enough to drag entire trees across mountains changed the logging world forever.